It's a 2 Lemsip day.
3 Lemsip day, I think.
3 Lemsip day. Other cold remedies are available.
Cowering. Can't even get my words out. This is going to be interesting.
This is a good one.
Good
well, it was
start.
my turn a couple of weeks ago because I lost my voice, didn't I? And I still think it's a bit croaky. What do our listeners think?
Oh,
but you're sounding all right.
I'm sounding all right.
You look terrible.
Terrible. Yeah, I'm feeling it.
And are you generally speaking in a positive mood about the country today?
Am I ever?
Okay, based on the fact that your normal, the middle of the dial for you is already reasonably on the pessimistic side.
Yeah, I had a weekend of just hearing lots of stories about just structural, systemic failures
in different parts of
the economy. And I don't know, like, how do you solve it? I mean,
mainly public sector stuff.
Yeah, and I sort of felt like I was being asked to solve it.
Right.
Over dinner.
Good luck with that. Yeah.
So I did my best.
so when it all gets fixed next year,
if we see, a couple of years' time,
you had the right chat with the right people at the right dinner.
Exactly. When we're all scooting around on hoverboards on, £60,000 a year universal basic income.
Minimum basic income. Yeah, keep that like that.
And we're all getting very creative and arty because of all this free time we've got. Yeah. I think they'll look back and say, remember that time we had that chat with that random guy?
It all seems to go back to that same conversation.
It is, yeah. So who knows? Maybe.
Well, I had a nightmare on the trains as well on the weekend. So all in all, the country's going to the dogs. Funny though, isn't it? Because when we talk about all of our companies that we work with, the private sector, I would say there's nowhere near as much pessimism. There's generally a good smattering of optimism around. Yeah. So maybe it's okay for those people listening to this who are in their own companies or private sector.
Well, I think you've almost got to, you've got to try and stay optimistic about these things, haven't you? There's plenty of worse places you could be living. Well, like you've almost got to.
The news every day is coming up with terrible examples. Yeah,
you've got to be. You've got to appreciate your own situation and try and find the silver linings in all of these cloudy skies.
One must. Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note,
on that very philosophical note,
let's do an upbeat podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast, which I think it might be our 50th episode, so happy birthday to us. This is put out by Wellmeadow Consulting here in Shrewsbury in the West Midlands, and every week we try and come up with something interesting for small and medium-sized business owners to listen to who are interested in growing their companies, and hopefully this week will be no exception. I'm Dave Parry, and with me is Richard Buckle.
With you in body.
In body, if not in spirit.
Not in spirit.
He's going downhill fast with one of the various winter ailments going around. So maybe next week I'll have it as well. You can't tell on camera, but there's about a mile between us across this very large table.
We'll have to get one of those COVID screens back up.
Remember when Putin did his thing in COVID? And, he had all of his lieutenants far away other end of the table. We need one of them.
We do. We need a Putin table.
Exactly. So this week we started a few weeks ago doing a kind of a business news slot, didn't we?
Yeah.
At the top of the show. So we can talk a bit about that. I think we can do a follow-on from what we talked about last week around the Christmas video that we did for the local museum. A bit of feedback on that, which would be good. And then I think we'll talk a bit about webinars this week.
Sounds good.
Something that we got stuck into recently.
Yep.
Got some experience around that. So business news first then. So just when we were talking the preamble there about how the UK is going to the dogs, just be glad you're not in Germany at the moment. There's always, that's a Schadenfreude thing, isn't it? There's always someone worse off than you. Yeah. But they just this morning published their economic stats, the latest lot, and their exports are down 8% on a year. Now remember post-Brexit we were moaning about the fact they've gone down by whatever they went down by here. 8% is a lot, especially for Germany, which relies so much on its exports. That's its thing. Imports are down 16% on a year. 16% on 1 year.
What's going on?
So I thought, what's going on? So I Googled, what's going on?
That could be a new catchphrase, couldn't it? What's going on?
You're having a laugh. You're going down. So I did that, and I got a Goldman Sachs summary of it, which is basically it's two things. There's loads of other things, obviously, but two main structural things. One is that they hitched their wagon to the China economy very closely, and it's really struggled coming out, on and off, start with the whole COVID thing. So they've struggled a bit with that. And then the other one is the transition to EVs. because so much of German industry is around automotive, and the Chinese and the Americans have stolen the march, and the Germans are playing catch up. Add on to that all the stuff about the energy price and their scramble to try and go for green electricity.
Yeah,
they're trying to find ways of investing more money. They've got the money, they're just trying to find projects to put it into, but they're so dependent on gas.
Yeah.
Remember that story that there's a BASF factory that uses more electricity than the whole of Belgium?
Oh, yeah.
Phenomenal, isn't
massive. That is massive.
So anyway, it's bad everywhere, but Germany, they've got a real structural thing to get through.
So I see some other business news. 25% of US retailers now have a keep it returns policy for low value.
Yeah, I was amazed by this. They won't tell you who it is, funnily enough. But they've worked out, and maybe this has long been the case, but the cost of managing what they call the reverse logistics, the return bit, exceeds the value of the product. Might as well just discard it.
I mean, is that not just becoming a license to steal?
Yeah. Basically, if you knew which ones are doing it.
Yeah.
And if that becomes more commonplace, because it's just common sense, why not just say you don't want it and then you get to keep it?
Well, I know. I think in some cities in America, I won't name them just in case I get it wrong, there's almost a de facto policy that shoplifting now, if their goods are under $100 or something, they just don't even bother trying to stop it.
Well, there was something in the paper in the UK about that as well, wasn't it? And saying the middle classes are the fastest growth sector for shoplifting.
Oh, I saw that article.
I think it's because of the self-scan, they say.
Self-scanning, yeah, sort of almost the
middle class. It's not. They say they wouldn't hide something in your bag or in your coat pocket, but they can easily blag it if they get caught not having scanned that extra bottle of whatever it was, Prosecco or something on the checkout. So, that's a bit dodgy one, isn't it?
Never been tempted.
Yeah. The other one I looked at, they've just published the latest vacancy statistics. And we talked about this a lot with the Roger Martin FAG reports that come out every quarter, because he always talked about, with 1.1 million, I think it got up to 1.2 million vacancies. And all those listening will know only too well how hard it has been and continues to be to recruit the good skills. Well, it's down now, but 975,000 still, so only just under 1 million. But I thought, why is that still so high when we've just had the stats reported on all the net migration figures, which show that over 2 years we've had 1.3 million net migration inbound? Yeah, well, surely they must be taking jobs. But the analysis, once again, was that it's the wrong mix, the wrong type of immigration. Lots of families, lots of students, not so many. There's still a lot in there that are economically active.
Right.
And the government's putting up the minimum salary as well, so they're actually taking more senior jobs, but not so much the fruit picking and factory labour jobs. So that's the problem there.
We need some robots, productivity, automation.
Yeah. Automation, that's what Roger keeps going on about, isn't it? Got to automate.
Bitcoin back to...
Yeah, I was wondering how your Bitcoin portfolio is going.
Bitcoin portfolio. Well, I moved a lot of my crypto portfolio into the NFT portfolio.
Oh, that was a good move.
That was a good move.
Less said about that, the better.
Yeah, don't come here for your investment advice.
Crypto advice, yeah.
I did get a little tip on a little crypto number, Bigozi, a while back, but as of yet, it's not lived up to promises.
I wonder how Archie's doing with his. He did a bit, didn't he? If Archie's listening, drop us an email.
I think he got out of Bitcoin.
Did he?
When it was doing quite well.
That's back to our Gartner hype cycle. Remember the episode we did on that?
Yeah.
The clever money gets out just before the top.
Gets out, but then I think it's gone up again, and so.
Yeah.
But apparently Ripple's supposed to be, it's not investment advice again, but XRP. But see, this is what annoys me. See, about 10 years ago, I was going to invest in XRP. I was going to put £1,000 into it when it was 0.00000023 or something like that.
Yeah.
It's now it did go to $3, and now it's at about 40 or 50 cents.
Right.
I thought, right.
Still would have been up. But how do you pick out a winner amongst the crowd?
I saw it.
It's like any...
I saw it. I thought, I read the runes.
The Sage of Shrewsbury.
I felt it in my waters.
He knew saw it coming.
He's got the gift.
Yeah, I'm not so sure.
But anyway, yeah.
Now, another one, though, you said you'd seen a news article about SME business owners.
SME business owners, apparently 56% of SME business owners in a recent survey are looking to sell.
Yeah, that's quite a shocker, isn't it?
Or the other way, looking to buy. I think the article was about that was more on the buy side.
Oh well, that's more positive then.
So that's more. But the reason growth. Being that there's
so many looking to sell.
SMEs are looking to sell after years of fatigue and COVID and whatnot.
So I think when they look back in 10, 20 years' time, there's definitely going to be a lot to pick over, isn't there, as the wake of the COVID lockdowns and what it did to everybody. And it's still happening today. You know, people are still wrestling with their debt profiles and whether they can be bothered carrying on in business anymore.
So I suppose, I guess, again, silver lining on clouds and things. There's probably lots of good opportunities out there for pick up a bargain or just
certainly if the reason that someone's looking to sell is that they've just had the stuffing knocked out of them, they've lost the momentum, maybe lost a key person.
Yeah, there could still be a very fundamentally sound business there.
Yeah, just needs a different level of energy or a different outlook or maybe more funding. We've seen that with a couple of businesses recently, haven't we? Come in with just enough funding to get it back to where it should be. How many businesses struggle week to week, month to month with their cash flow, spend all their time worrying about which supplier to pay,
rather than
and yet for the injection of a bit of working capital, you could get back to running the business properly.
Exactly.
Always easier said than done. Okay, well, there's a good roundup of some business news then, just to keep things going. Good. Excellent for that.
Right.
We should have a jingle at this point, shouldn't we? That's all. I'll push a button on the mixing desk over there and it'll do something.
So if you're listening, not watching, I just took a massive gulp of coffee there.
And nearly spilt it over himself.
Whilst I think Dave was looking to hand over for me to sort of ask the question.
You didn't say that. So we said we would follow up on the podcast we did last week where we talked about making a Christmas video.
Yep, and storytelling and that type of thing.
Storytelling and all that stuff. So you've had some good feedback on that.
Got some very good feedback on it. So it was very good. I think we were getting ready to do the shoot that afternoon. And we went and it all was very successful. We had a great little team of helpers and the family that came on board to act for us were really good.
Yeah, doing a casting call for our videos for going up in the world now. Yeah.
So, but yeah, it all came together very well. A lot of the feedback we've had has been, well, pretty much all the feedback we've had has been really positive. It's very much like a John Lewis advert, Marks and Spencer's advert, that type of thing. Made people cry. I mean, for the right reasons as well. I should point that out.
Yeah, exactly.
So if
anybody hasn't seen that yet, where do they find that? Where do they search?
It will be on our socials, our LinkedIn, Shrewsbury Museum and Art Gallery. That was the client, so it's on their socials.
Great.
But yeah, I mean, it's testament to everyone who was involved in it. Really, it was very well planned. It was very well executed, and
so we're waiting for John Lewis to give us a call, are we? For next year?
Yeah, well, I mean, in fact, we have had a couple of,
inquiries
inquiries off the back of it, just to say,
just a week on,
how do we help do that? So I guess go and have a look at it if you haven't already. I mean, we could probably post a link to it in the blog of this episode.
Yeah, no, it's good. I just thought to loop back round to what we talked about last week. We got a bit more feedback from it, which is good. Okay, main subject for this week then, webinars. Go on, let's start with a definition, because I think my mum might have asked me, what's a webinar?
What's a webinar then? Definition.
I was just, where's the word come from? It's a seminar, right? It's a seminar on the web.
On the web, yeah.
So the question that I then get asked is, what's the difference between a webinar and a podcast? So how would you, they are different, right? This is a podcast, this is definitely not a webinar. Why is it different?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a webinar is maybe more, I don't know, direction. Probably more intentional in the information it's looking to impart. I'd say it's probably one difference. A podcast is more of a, I'm not saying it's not particularly a deep dive on any particular subject. It can be, but it's maybe more of a dialogue or and there's not a live audience, maybe, or there's not.
Well, I guess some seminars end with that Q&A bit, and maybe that's the difference. Maybe the main bit of the seminar is what the webinar does, presenting information like a lecture. And then the Q&A bit at the end is the chat about the subject, where you maybe get a bit more anecdote and colour, but it's less formally structured.
I suppose as well, maybe, and this, I guess I'll make another point after this, but a webinar, you'd come together for a webinar.
Yes.
There's a time and a place and a date, and a bit like a traditional seminar, isn't it? You'd all have to gather in a place.
Yeah.
I suppose the webinar has made the geographical element of that unnecessary.
Yeah.
Whereas a podcast is probably more consumed individually.
True, and not necessarily at the time that it was recorded.
Yeah.
Whereas a webinar has quite an important live element to it, where people can ask questions during the way through, and the presenters will react and answer questions or respond to comments.
Well, that was going to lead on to my point I was going to make, that it doesn't necessarily have to be for, if you're recording your webinars, you're actually you can get a lot of value. And that's one of the things that maybe we'll touch on it later in terms of how do you record a webinar, how do you structure a webinar, bearing in mind potentially 50, 60, 70% of people that watch it won't be watching it when it's live.
It'll be after the event. Yeah, so I guess if it's a subject where you want to be able to interact because you've got particular angles on it you want to ask about, or you want to steer the flow of it in some way, then you turn up live. And if it's available at the right time, then you turn up live. Yeah. Otherwise, as you say, you can consume it afterwards as a recording, just like you probably would as a podcast. Although I would say, would you not say that webinars are only really viewed visually rather than listened to? Whereas podcasts, where we record this with video, most people consume it audio only, don't they?
Yeah. Oh, I suppose, I think that's back to the imparting information, isn't it? So if you're using a slide deck,
that's a key difference.
So if you're doing if you think back to a traditional seminar, you would normally have a PowerPoint, death by PowerPoint type of scenario, and a webinar is just a web version of that, isn't it? So there's other information that you're pointing to, maybe a graph or something, which is quite hard to do on a podcast.
Yeah, we can do that here easily because not enough people watch it. And if you're out driving the car, walking the dog, it's not possible. Whereas I think you're right, that's a key thing about, you wouldn't imagine a webinar being just pictures of people talking. Yeah. There's probably going to be slides, graphs, pictures, whatever it is that you should.
And again, we can come on to it, but I think just the amount of time that we spent on the visual aspect of the webinar versus how much time we would spend on the visual aspect of the podcast.
Yeah.
In the actual, we spend time thinking about trailers or how to advertise a podcast. But in the actual podcast, the visual is just a camera on you and me, isn't it?
Sorry about that for all those viewers that are having to watch this.
Those poor souls. Yeah.
So what would you advise companies as to who should and shouldn't, and why would you do a webinar? And maybe compare and contrast that with whether you should do a podcast.
Well, I think one is maybe the cadence. So I think a podcast, we're coming down on the view that really to make it work, you've really got to do a weekly podcast. You've got to keep that discipline and cadence going. I would say for a webinar, you could probably push it to maybe monthly. It's not quite as reliant upon the week to week cadence because it's just a different type of engagement that you're looking for.
Yeah. Do you think webinars have to be even as frequently as monthly? Could you get away with, based on special occasions, doing one quarterly or something? Or do you
I suppose. I think it's more about the discipline that you're getting into. I think more and more I look at this as this content cadence.
But if Roger Martin fagged, and maybe he'll listen to this and decide, but if he did a quarterly webinar instead of just pushing out his newsletter, I would have thought he'd have thousands of people turning up.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people consume his newsletter, don't they?
That's a good point.
So that doesn't have to be there monthly, as long as the quality of the material and people know what to expect and they're looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think probably the point is if you've got a regular cadence of doing it, so whether that's quarterly for you or whether it's monthly, I think you'd be struggling to for an SME, if we're talking here, you'd probably struggle to resource a weekly webinar unless it was going to be quite low quality, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Because you just wouldn't have time to put it all together.
Or you need a big team to help produce it.
Yeah,
it's like a TV program, isn't it?
Yeah. So,
okay, cadence then, definitely a big difference. Podcast, weekly. We've talked before, haven't we, about could companies get away with it fortnightly? Some even choose to ask about monthly because we're having these conversations now, aren't we, with various companies. And I think, as you say, we've come down on the side that unless it's weekly, really, you lose the momentum.
And I think you could do one, fortnightly or monthly. You could do anything. But I think the more that we look at it, the more that discipline of saying you're almost trying to change your culture a little bit to say you've got to get into this on a regular basis. Otherwise, it just slips. And
so we've talked about podcasts before, of course. So I'm raising that as a subject to try and distinguish why then did we decide to do a webinar? Well, remember back to what triggered us to do it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe a lead gen angle in this. And maybe here's another important difference between a webinar and a podcast. So with a podcast, it's actually quite hard to know who your listeners are. So unless you've got a huge following,
like radio, I suppose.
Yeah. So how do you know who's listening to this podcast? Now we know a few people. We get the fan mail. Thank you very much. But by and large, we don't know who's listening because you don't get that data. You don't.
When you sign up to Spotify or Apple,
you don't have to put your email address in or anything like that. So
well, even if you do, the podcast producers don't get to see that.
Yeah, and so there are ways around that. We could create an SME VIP club or something like that.
Yeah, some of them do that.
And that's one way of engaging with the community. But with a webinar, you are having to register with that. So you are getting that information about who you're talking to, which then, back to the lead gen point, gives you that ability to follow up from the webinar in a much more intentional way than you can from a podcast episode.
And do you not think it's also accepted that in a webinar there is more of an overt lead gen angle to it? Whereas a podcast, if, we talked when we had Ed Nell in here as a guest a couple of weeks ago about podcasts maybe being a bit too salesy, and he talked about the American ones being even more salesy, an advert at the beginning and all that.
Yeah.
And I don't think when you sign up for a podcast, that's what you're after. You're not trying to tune in for the adverts. You want the content.
Right.
Whereas I think a webinar, someone is giving you their expertise and discussing it, but very much from an angle of saying, if you want more of this, get back in touch.
Yeah. Well, I think it's back to when you probably consume the content as well. A lot of people listen to podcasts in their own time outside of a work. Not many people probably listen to unless you're in the car, maybe listen to a podcast during work hours. Whereas I would say 90% of webinars are probably part of it's almost part of a professional development, isn't it? I'm going on this webinar.
Well, that's interesting. You're right. I would have thought entirely acceptable to watch a webinar at your desk during work hours in a way that listening to a podcast maybe seems a bit, that's what you should be doing at home, even if it's a work-related subject, which is odd, isn't it? Because it shouldn't be. You're still professional development and it might be relevant to your job.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're doing, isn't it? But it's quite hard to listen to something if you're trying to learn as well as do it. It's like pat your head and rub your tummy type of thing, isn't it? It's whereas a webinar, I think, because it is almost designed to be instructional rather than just here's some information.
Yeah, and it's got to be helpful. I don't think you can hide everything behind the, I'm not going to give you the detail, here's just the overview. And you've got to really help people with it.
But then, as you say, there's that follow-on. I think it's much more acceptable to say, right, if you've enjoyed if you've learned something, but you want to know more, then get in touch.
And you know who they are because they've registered and you've got their emails. Okay, so that's a bit of the difference between and why you would do one or the other. Let's talk a little bit about the practicalities of actually setting one up and all of that.
Yeah.
Where do you do it? What's the backdrop? I see lots of them done at people's desks, just like they're on a Zoom call or a Teams call, normal. I don't like that personally, and I think we tried to do something different, didn't we, ourselves, because we didn't want to make it, us.
Yeah.
We don't want to just follow the crowd, do we? We want to do something a bit different.
Yeah, try and push the boat out a little bit. Yeah, so I think, again, it's back to that, how do you engage your audience? Back to if you it's almost a little bit like if you're doing a seminar, right? You probably choose a good location. You wouldn't, if you're doing a seminar, you wouldn't say, hey, everyone come to my office and stand at my desk and I'm going to stand in front of my computer. That's effectively what you're doing with a Zoom webinar.
Yeah, you try and choose a nice local conference place or meeting room or museum like we were talking about before.
So yeah, we went with the view of saying, should you even sit down to do a webinar? You wouldn't sit, maybe you would sit down at a seminar, I don't know, but we thought, well, actually, what's the kind of energy that you get when you're sitting down?
Imagine standing behind a lectern at the front with the big slides. Yeah. You imagine the big Tim Cook thing, the way he does the. That's I would have thought the feel you're going for, not just sat behind a screen.
So we said, okay, well, let's do the stand-up version. Yep. So then that leads on to a whole other thing. Okay, well, how are you going to film this? Where are you going to stand? How are you going to get your marks on the floor? And what's the backdrop going to be? And is it just against a blank wall, or do you have a set around it and all of that type of thing?
So we put quite a lot of effort into that. We used our podcast studio as the environment to do it in. It looked a bit different lighting, but a lot of thought went into the lighting. People was fastidious about that, making sure that looked right, the backdrop, like you say. And of course, because you're dealing with a slide presentation as well, you've got to think about how to weave that in without it making it look a bit awkward.
So I think one of the things we were keen to try and do was to not, so Dave was speaking on the webinar, so to not have you in the little corner, little box, whilst we're just doing a big slide presentation, because that sort of, if you were going to do that, you might as well sit down and just have your head maximised.
So you can see,
That's what you can see. So it became a little bit of a logistical camera challenge to try and
technical challenges with
work out how to get the slide information in, how to get Dave speaking in. So we got there in the end.
Yeah. And I think there were some clever tricks we used, which were quite handy. And not only did you not want to have me as the speaker just in the small box when the slides were on, you'd rather nothing at all. But similarly, in between, if there's nothing happening on the slide, you want to get rid of the slide.
Yeah.
Because it's not very engaging having a big static image of something that you've seen already now,
Yeah.
and you're bored with that. And then the person who you're talking to, you want to be able to engage with them a bit, because it's for a lot of people live. So we managed all of that, didn't we? We did all that differently, which was quite nice. So standing up, good set. The whole way we interleaved the slide presentation with the speaker.
I think a point on the slides as well to make is so the webinar subject was around the sort of introduction to HubSpot CRM. And so rather than just do a live demo, what we actually did was recorded the demo and then were able to edit down, sort of, waiting for pages to load and all of that. So it was a much more engaging experience.
And speed up keyboard entry stuff.
So you don't have the, you don't have that kind of
I think that's a good
agonizing.
tip. Anybody demonstrating anything software-wise, or even anything else where you've not got complete control of how it might happen live, record those bits. It doesn't take anything away. We still talked over them live, but we had the video itself was recorded to demonstrate the point.
And I think if you start to watch adverts maybe for software, you'll actually see, if you watch it with a critical eye, they're not showing you the whole screen. They will zoom in onto a particular function that they want your attention to be on. And so we were doing a little bit of that with some of the videos as well.
Yeah, it's a good point, because often there's a lot of real estate on the screen and the thing you're clicking is off in one corner somewhere. It
gives you that opportunity to say, right, this is what we want you to look at. This is what we're talking about. So
that was good. Just another bit of the domestics of it all as well. I thought the countdown at the beginning worked very well, because people do tend to log in a little bit earlier.
So we put together a bit of a show reel of some of our work, some video stuff, also with the countdown, so you kind of knew where you were. And again,
some audio on that as well, so people
test the speakers and things. But yeah, it was a little bit of an experiment. It's to see when do people log into a webinar? Do they come in 15 minutes? It's probably maybe a bit extreme, but who knows? It's just once we've got the footage, it didn't cost anything to put it in. So it's a good way, I suppose, for if you were thinking about putting on a webinar, almost see that initial 5, 10, 15 minutes or whatever before it starts as a way of advertising. So it's another way of advertising your business. So you could put in show reel videos or a slide deck or something. It's not, don't just waste that time. People
might be there watching.
You've got a couple of minutes before where people are logging in, and you've got their attention. So why not use it? Free advertising.
So there was the preamble for that. There was the good way that we put the slides together. What about Q&A? How did we manage that?
So we had Andy monitoring the chat. So in the room probably was obviously you were speaking. Andy was managing the chat. Pete was managing the cameras. I was just sitting somewhere. Quality control. I wasn't allowed into the inner sanctum of the room. No, but so questions were coming in. Andy was sort of moderating those and relaying those to Dave. Probably a good tip is to always have some loaded questions, pre-prepared questions, so that you can.
As it turns out, we
didn't need them.
I think you're right. You should have those. Yeah.
But yeah, so that was that all seemed to work. We did play around a little bit with the chat, but it didn't.
Yeah, I don't know what it is that makes the chat suddenly come alive. I've been on some webinars where you get a whole load of "Hello from Birmingham. I'm in Belgium. Hello, I'm in Southampton," and we didn't get any of that stuff. Maybe you need a number of people.
Maybe you need to seed it, or
So, what would we do differently next time? I think we'd probably have a bit more time to promote it beforehand. We did a bit of PPC promoting of it, didn't we? We were partnered with the March's Growth Hub, and they helped to push it out on their channels, and we did our social as well. So we got a reasonable attendee in the end.
Yeah, we did an email campaign on it as well, so that drove a few people in.
What's quite interesting as well is some companies had 3 or 4 attendees from the same company. So clearly one of them had spotted it and said, let's all watch this.
Yeah.
Even if they weren't in the same room, they'd all logged on at the same time, and then they could discuss it afterwards. So certainly seemed to capture the imagination. People wanted to find out more about it.
I think one thing we'll do, lesson learned, is to just record the webinar.
We talked about someone about that. We went to a lot of effort to do it live, and you realise that the Q&A that comes in tends to all come in at the end, so you don't need to be able to respond to interaction halfway through.
Yeah.
And
So
I think we could give a better product, actually, if we edited the various snippets beforehand, take out any of the small delays and make it much more content rich.
And I think as well, I mean, it's even, do you need to wear the same shirt and all that type of stuff? I think people would forgive you. Again, back to the point we made earlier, probably if you use your webinar well, 80% of the people that watch it won't be watching it when it's live. And then now you've got that content, you can start to use that for other campaigns. It's kind of evergreen content, really.
Yeah.
So that's how we intend to use these.
Yeah.
And again, we're thinking of saying, why don't we batch up the production of 4 or 5 webinars into a couple of days, which again is just much more efficient.
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. And I'm not quite sure how many people who've listened before have been prompted to embark on the podcast journey, but maybe some may be more tempted by the webinar journey, a bit more related to what they do, a bit more lead gen, a bit more focused on getting some interest straight away.
Yeah, and I don't think it's quite as time intensive as having a podcast. I think you can really condense what you do.
I think if you've got the hang of it, and certainly clearly anyone we know, we'd give some advice on that, and by all means get in touch. But you're right, I think you can probably prepare certainly for a batch of them, do several webinar preps all in one day, whereas the podcasts being weekly.
I think a lot of businesses will probably have the information around them to do a webinar, because it's probably not, it's particularly technical business where you've got, maybe you're already doing CPD, or you're doing technical pitches where you're talking about, technical elements of your business, production, whatever. A lot of that material is already around. Whereas I think sometimes with a podcast, we speak to someone the other day when it has a podcast, said we're running out of ideas. How do we keep it? That takes the energy to keep a podcast going. So.
Yeah, you set yourself up a big challenge there. Okay, good. Well, I'm looking forward to our next one. I think we've already put the date in the diary for next February sometime. So we're going to be doing another one. And then that will be the beginning of our monthly routines, I think, once we've got into the hang of them. So stay tuned and we'll give you an update when we've done a few more, and maybe give you a few more lessons learned from how we've done it. So thanks again for listening to the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow, where every week we try and come up with something else interesting for business owners and managers to learn from as they try to grow their businesses. As we ask you every week, please share what we're doing. Either click the follow and the little bell icon on your podcast station, wherever you get it from, or just tell your friends, drop them an email, drop them a link, whatever. It's all very good for us to get a wider audience and get more feedback on what to talk about. In the meantime, good luck with your business.